Welcome to the Backyard Professor live show tonight. I have Mormonish in the studio, and I have a very honorable scholar, Margaret Toscano, and we are going to blow your minds and open your eyes. Let's get this show on the road. Okay, let's see who is in the chat tonight. Mark Crispin first. Yeah, baby. That's for you, pal. Tim Rathbone, welcome. Learned and wise, I think. Gosh, I've thought that myself about me. Welcome to the show. Alan Zabriskie, good to see you, my friend. Who else? Tim Rathbone and Mark has been carrying on the conversation. Lemos Newton, Barry Richens. Hello, Barry, my dear friend. Good to see you here. Doug Vincent, the man. Andrea Timmers, welcome, welcome. It's good to see all of you. We have Wanda Anthony. Nice to see you too, dear. And we have Mosia. Is actually Mosiah, so we have to be reverent tonight somewhat. And we have talked to, if you'll notice, we have one actual professor with us tonight, so this is the real deal. Radio Free Mormon, the man. Yes, good to see you, my friend. So I have just about Tiger. Good to see Dan Vogel. Dan Vogel. All hail Dan Vogel. We always love Dan Vogel. You know Dan Vogel, don't you, Margaret?
Yes.
Good. He's here, so we have to behave. Don Smith, good to see you. Okay, look, that's enough noise from the Backyard Professor. You didn't come to hear me, even though you're going to unfortunately have to, because I am over the top thrilled to have three of the coolest people on my show I've ever had. Mormonish, welcome back, you two. We've got Rebecca Biblioteca and Landon Brophy. How's it going?
Good. We survived conference weekend, I think. Barely, right, Landon?
That's right. And we may not be here to hear Carrie, but we're sure here to see him because you look fabulous in that shirt, Carrie.
Carrie looks amazing. Yes, he does. I have to say. Whew.
Not as good as you three, but I'm in a close fourth. So we decided we're going to wear pink tonight. So this is good. Only on the BYP Live do you get an actual cross-dresser. My wife warned me, honey, that's my shirt. And I said, it's the only pink one I can find. So I have a glorious scholar, Margaret Toscano, and I'm cross-dressing. I apologize, Margaret. So how are you doing? We have a world-class author here with Margaret Toscano. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you. And I survived conference weekend because I didn't listen to anything.
That's why you were so happy and in a good mood. You're not feeling
yeah,
good.
Exactly. Smile.
Nice.
Well, report.
That's good. We do have Radio Free. Hey, Peter Higgs, good to see you. Don't want to miss you out. We do have Radio Free Mormon here who has been providing updates on the conference, and a lot of us do that. So even though we did miss conference, we aren't going to miss the essence of conference distilled through the filter of actual truth with some of us podcasters. So that's always a bonus. And so this church essay is quite the interesting situation, isn't it? Weren't the essays supposed to, correct me if I'm wrong, Margaret, but can I call you Margaret, or should I call you Dr. Toscano?
Yes. No, Margaret, please.
We're somewhat informal around here, especially Landon when he makes comments about me. So really laugh at his jokes.
I do have Margaret's bio, by the way, that we can cover to kind of.
Oh yeah. Yeah. You notice Landon conveniently didn't send it to me so that he gets the glory of introducing Margaret properly.
That is my fault, Carrie. I had it. I sent it to Landon. I did not send it to you. And during your fabulous info, I was texting Landon, bio, quick, pull it up. So, we're trying to appear professional on the surface.
Well, we're not trying very hard because we're so darn excited and having so much fun. We have to laugh a little on the show, but we have some really excellent analysis and information that we also will give you. One of my first things I would like to do in honor of the glorious efforts of the church to, how do you put it, become more open with their honesty and their sources, and to actually share the true and everlasting loving reality of their history, etc., without keeping things out and without necessarily fudging the facts or gaslighting, etc., is we like to get rid of all of the old crap of all of their former history. And so, to honor that, stuff like this, Farms Review of the Book of Mormon, we got to get rid of this crap. And I've got copies. If any of you guys have apologetic information that you want to throw away, get rid of it, because none of this crap, Biblical Mormonism by Hopkins, no good. Offenders for a Word by Dan Peterson. How Anti-Mormons Play Word Games. Man, this whole book is a word game book. Chuck it. Book of Mormon Journal of Studies, Journal of Book of Mormon Studies. I've got volumes and volumes and volumes and volumes. Farms Review of Books, stuff like Keith Norman's crap, stuff more Farms Review of Books, more Journal of Book of Mormon Studies, more Farms Review of Books, more Book of Mormon Studies, more Farms Review of Books, more Journal of Book of Mormon Studies. How deep does the pile of crap go?
I have to say, I'm a little concerned. We're only 7 minutes in and we're already throwing books. I don't know what's going to happen.
Well, we're throwing away falsehood to get to the
Yes, we are. Yes, we are.
All right, now that's enough goofing out. Oh man, I broke my keyboard. I broke the cue. Oh, that's.
Do you have the bio, Landon? Why don't we read that while Carrie figures out his phone?
Yes, let's get to the bio while I fix my cue.
Because we're going to show that we can throw away the crap, because we've got someone of such great rapport here as Margaret Toscano. So Margaret Toscano, PhD, has been speaking, writing, and publishing about Mormon feminism since 1984. She's an associate professor of classics and comparative studies at the University of Utah, where she teaches classes about mythology, classical civilization, religious studies, hell, immortality, and all levels of the ancient Greek and Latin languages. She is the co-editor of the book Hell and Its Afterlife, Historical and Contemporary Perspectives. She also works on the reception of classical culture in popular media and is currently working on an article about Hades and Persephone, as well as a book on the Mormon Heavenly Mother. So someone who knows hell so well, welcome to hell.
Actually, my students love the class on hell. It's a lot of fun.
Well, hopefully we'll have as much fun here.
That's right.
Well, we're going to raise some here then. We already have. So good deal. So why don't we just jump in? Let me do it this way, you guys. Let's do this first slide, the Gospel Topic Essays series. And this particular essay we want to talk about is Joseph Smith's teachings about priesthood, temple, and women. So you know by the title that we're in for a real treat. And overall, Margaret, would you like to read these four parts?
Let me talk about each of those.
Sure.
And by the way, since you said that, you already threw out some books and we're here to be open-minded, people may disagree with my interpretation. And I welcome, challenges. So I think that's a really important part of scholarship and discussions, is that, we can disagree. And, but it's always important that we're using good primary sources, which I try to do in this essay. So the church's essay is divided into these four parts. They start out with what it was the early Latter-day Saint understanding of priesthood. They talk about Joseph Smith and the Nauvoo Relief Society, priesthood in the temple, and women in priesthood today. But before we go into each section, I think it's important to say that this piece was put out in, I think it was 2013, 2014, the church essay was. And this is very important for two reasons, because they're responding to two things. First of all, in 2012, Joseph Smith's discourses to the Female Relief Society in Nauvoo, which took place between March 1842, so the founding of the Relief Society, and April, in those few months, very important primary documents those were not available to most people, or at least they weren't easily accessible, but they went up in 2012. And Carrie and I were talking about that. I first discovered the sort of real essays, or the real, discourses, which were changed, by the church and were not available until 1980, when Andy E. Hatt and Lyndon Cook put forth the words of Joseph Smith. And those changed me. They changed my life and led to my first speech, Sunstone speech, and essay that I published in 84 and 85. So why are those so important? I'll come back to that in a second. The second thing that happened, so those speeches of Joseph Smith, which we have the original documents of, you can see the handwriting, even in the handwriting of Eliza R. Snow. They're really phenomenal. Those came online in 2012, so they were easily accessible. The second thing is that you had the ordained women movement in 2013. Now, I don't know if any of your audience knows about that. I was part of it. And of course, Kate Kelly is the person who's famous for this, but she certainly did not start this alone. Interesting that she got excommunicated in 2014, but in 2013 there was a group of women who first put up a website where they had testimonials of people who felt that women should be ordained, and then there were two actions at General Conference. The first one was April 2013, and then the second one the fall. And in both of those, women marched from that little park kind of by the, on South Temple over to the Tabernacle. And I was part of the group, we asked for admission to the priesthood session.
And they let you right in, right? Open doors, red carpet, the whole ball of wax. I remember.
Happy to see it, right? Well, we were obviously turned away, but it made big news all over the country, but also international. I know I was interviewed by different papers at that time. And, interestingly, that you had the church essay that came out not long after that, and you had both the General Relief Society presidency and Dallin Oaks giving talks where, they're trying to address some of those issues, basically covering over like we always see, but at the same time, taking a tack that the essay does. So I want to start out by saying that the essay does two things. So really the essay focuses, it's really a response to the Relief Society speeches of Joseph Smith. And in their essay, they start out by saying, now some people, when they read the discourses of Joseph Smith to the Relief Society, they're going to be really startled because he seems to use priesthood language in relationship to women, as though he's saying that they have a right to priesthood. And in fact, I should tell you that 4 of the most startling statements that Joseph Smith makes in those discourses that you see in Eliza R. Snow's handwriting, he said, I intend to make of this society, meaning the Relief Society, a kingdom of priests, as in Paul's day, as in Enoch's day, as in Paul's day. So that's one startling statement. Another one, he says, I want this society to move according to the ancient priesthood. And then he also says to them, I am going to turn the key to you, and better things are now going to happen for the relief for you women. And then he also tells them that their organization should be organized in the order of the priesthood. So, there's some really strong statements. And if you do a cross-reference to something he says in that book that you also had, Carrie, the manuscript history, he says, he comments on these discourses where he says, I gave these lectures to the Relief Society to show them how they would come in possession of the priesthood, its blessings, its keys, etc. Right? So very strong. So the church essay starts out with kind of like, now everybody hold on to your hats because we don't want you to get all upset or, worried about, oh, what's happening here? What did Joseph Smith mean? And then this is basically their thesis. They say Joseph Smith never said or did anything in regard to women in the priesthood that is any different than the current church. He never ordained women. He never gave them keys. He never did anything like that. All that he did, and all of his successors, they've all taken exactly the same position, and it's exactly what the church teaches. And so here is where I, in my critique, use the term gaslighting. Because basically, I think that what they're doing is a gaslighting technique. I mean, now that's such a popular term, everybody accuses everybody else of gaslighting. But actually, it was kind of developed much earlier in a scholarly context for responding to various kinds of, critique sort of thing. It goes back to a 1930 play and so forth. But I think there are gaslighting. They're saying, look, what you think you're seeing, it's all an illusion. It's not really true. That's not really true. And we're going to show you, in this essay that, what you think you see in those Relief Society lectures is not true. Joseph Smith never taught anything or did anything that was any different than the current leaders use. So that is the most important thing to say. And in particular, they say he never ordained women. He never gave them keys. He never intended the Relief Society to be a priesthood organization. The temple did not bestow priesthood. There's no priesthood bestowed in the temple other than sealings between a husband and wife. And so that is their main idea. And then the 4 sections that you showed, Carrie, are all to support that. But I do want to say one other thing that they do in their initial framing is that they try to have this really positive tone, right? Like, and they start with this and they end with this. Women are allowed to do so many wonderful things that you don't get in other churches. I mean, women can speak in general conference. I'm using my Relief Society voice here. They can speak in general conference. They can pray in general conference. They can witness baptisms now. They can, they can use the power of the priesthood when they're in church callings. So they have all of these things, and then they end that way too. And of course, my critique is both, well, first of all, interestingly, they never say the negative things, the things that women cannot do. They never say that no woman ever presides over a man. No woman can ever make a decision apart from the male leaders. Yeah. No woman can do any of these things that they say are also positive without, they have to be under the direction of priesthood leaders. So that's very important. And so what I do in the essay is I kind of give an overview of their argument, and then I go through and bring in documents that I think challenge them. So I want to say one more thing about this, and maybe then you guys have some questions before we go on to the other parts. But I feel like the strength of my essay is that I use Joseph Smith against them. The church loves, I mean, I sometimes joke and say the only thing that the present church likes about Joseph Smith is that they trace their priesthood authority back to him. For them, the most important thing for the current leaders is their authority, their power. They're the ones that direct the church. And they trace that priesthood back to Joseph Smith, who claimed that he got it from God. And he is their justification for their priesthood authority. So what I try to do in the essay is to say that Joseph Smith's statements about women in priesthood, when you actually look at the complexity of them in the historical context, that his views contradict and undermine the current LDS priesthood structure of control and totalism. So that's kind of, I mean, that's what I see as my contribution.
See, what I love about this is when I had my faith crisis, I went through and fell off the bandwagon, and I left the boat while it was sinking. And I do have a life preserver. It's called Truth. My buddy now, who was my arch nemesis on the message boards for decades, Randy Jordan, and I'll give a shout out to you, my good friend. We talked on the phone when he found out that I ended up no longer believing and quit being an apologist. And he said, wow, really? You're swift. It only took you 23 years. And he said, do you know why we always defeated your shirts? And I go, no, I never could get the angle on him. He said, because we always quoted Joseph Smith back to you. I said, no, you didn't. He goes, oh, yes, sir. He said, you want to defeat the church, you quote Joseph Smith to him. So it does my heart good. And when you told me that earlier, I went and reread your essay. And by golly, that's just what you do. That's why Margaret Toscano's essay, that's why we're having her here, the LDS Gospel Topics series. I saw this first announced on John DeLynn, Mormon Stories. Now the Backyard Professor and Mormonish is pushing this book. It is essential reading for a more complete analysis. And this is one of the things that is a crazy phenomenon. We are quoting Joseph Smith more now than we ever did as apologists. Irony, huh?
Yeah, it is irony. And of course, we talked earlier. I really think that maybe this is one of the worst church essays. I think it's very insidious, that it sounds all sugar-coated and lovely and nice, but it is really undercutting women's ability to be any kind of on an equal footing with men in the church. It uses this kind of sugar-coating and, oh, we just love women and they have so much power and they can do so many things. And, oh, look at all the nice changes we've made, like in the temple and this place and that thing. But it really uses that to, kind of cover over the real issues, almost like it's saying, oh, any woman who actually is not satisfied after all we've done for you, you're just a complainer and a negative person.
And a lazy girl.
Yeah, I think it's an insidious essay. So I don't know, Rebecca, you were feeling the same way.
I was feeling the same way. And as our listeners and viewers know, Carrie and Landon and I have gone through a number of essays. And I have to say, this is the one that really got to me. And I thought, this is the worst one I've ever read, because as Margaret alluded to at the beginning of the essay, I'll even read just a little piece. It says, among other things, Latter-day Saint women preach sermons and Sunday meetings and church general conference. They serve full-time proselyting missions. It goes through all these things. And in my mind, I kept adding under the direction of men. Everything they said here that made it sound, as Margaret said, just wonderful. What's wrong with you for feeling unsatisfied or unfulfilled? Everything is under the direction of men. There's nothing that you can do where you can make an actual decision, implement something with finality without checking, and by men, I mean priesthood. I'm not saying anything about men. I'm saying priesthood power. And yeah, that's why the essay just goes from bad to worse, just with that. And you read it and you feel like, oh, I guess I should feel really happy. I'm a woman in the church. Look at this. I can hand out towels and I can push the lever that raises and lowers the microphones. Why would I be unsatisfied? What's wrong with me? I must be a bitch.
You can say the opening prayer now. It's neither one of you two did.
Opening prayer? Yeah, no.
Yeah, I remember when I couldn't. I'm old. But, I think it's interesting too, Rebecca, that actually the present priesthood structure also subordinates men. And I think this is an important point that I'll probably make several times in our discussion, that from my point of view, when you look at the statements of Joseph Smith or so forth, and that there is this change from language where I think that the way Joseph Smith describes priesthood, especially as it relates to temple, is that it was supposed to be invested in individuals, that you put on the robes of the priesthood in the temple and you went through ordinances as an individual This is not about sealings of families, but it was individual. You went through this ritual process to get to the veil where you personally talk to God. And so the priesthood was invested in you. The church uses the language of delegation. Like they'll say, oh, women have authority and power of the priesthood. Oh, of course, they can only use it as it's delegated to them by church leaders when they have a calling. And as soon as your calling is over, that power and authority is gone. But I think the same is true for how they treat men. They see men absolutely as subordinate, and you only can act when you have delegation, and the leaders, the hierarchy controls the whole thing.
Yeah, and be anxiously engaged in a good cause as long as you have the brethren's permission.
Exactly.
Yeah, that was one of the things I noticed on this essay as I was reading it. Of course, Rebecca called me right up furious when she started reading it, but I said we better get Margaret to do this. But as I studied the essay, and then as I've talked with you, and obviously as I've worked with Rebecca, it's amazing to me as I see women as intelligent as the two of you are, as hardworking, as knowledgeable in the doctrine, and I see how much effort. Like working with Rebecca, I see how much effort she puts in every day to doing the podcasting and to doing the work that she does. And then she goes to church and she's the piano player in the primary. And that's, maybe the most she can hope for, because they're really, what position can a woman have higher than Relief Society president? Really, to me, the highest position in a ward for a woman is the wife of the bishop, because she has more control over what happens in the ward and what changes in the ward than the Relief Society president does. And it goes all the way up. You look at Wendy Nelson is known because of who she married, not because of anything she did in the church. And how sad it is that women of your accomplishments are not allowed to lead or not allowed to use those gifts that you have to enrich other people. You're limited simply because of your gender. And that became apparent in this essay as I read through there. So Margaret, your writing was just, I'm going, this woman is brilliant as I read it. And I needed you to explain this to me, because I'm going, I don't understand the difference between this type of priesthood and this type of priesthood.
Yeah, we can get back to that. But I think one of the things I try to do in my essay, besides the fact that I'm subtly using, Joseph Smith against them, but the other thing is by trying to maintain a sort of even tone where I'm not just lambasting, which I could. And personally, when I'm in my office or reading stuff, I do, get really worked up and rant and walk around and so forth.
You threw books. Come on, fess up.
Well, I don't know. I didn't bring enough books I have this is my husband's upstairs office. I have another office. I have my downstairs office. I have thousands of books, right? But I don't have any handy to throw. At any rate, I think it was important that I tried to be balanced, and to try to not just, rant. I think the strongest thing, I think my argument is strong, but the biggest kind of criticism I give is to say that they're gaslighting, which I think they absolutely are. They just are. They're trying to say, oh, you're not, what you see is not really there. Yeah.
You were much more calm than I ever could have been. So I'm very grateful that you wrote that essay without question. Obviously, Rebecca would have been under complete control of herself. So let's see. Do we want to go? Yeah.
We can go through each one of them. And I have a couple little things to say about each one. And sure, I certainly want you to ask questions.
Sure.
So basically in this first part, they go through the really kind of, typical sort of narrative for priesthood. Maybe they will say, well, at first, in the 1830s, at first it was more sort of the idea of more Protestant in the sense that priesthood was the right to preach and so forth. But then we have the revelation of John the Baptist and Peter, James, and John. And then we have the whole setup of the ecclesiastical priesthood, the priesthood. And by ecclesiastical, basically that term means the church priesthood, right? What is used in the church, ecclesiastical, right? But they would say, well, that was all revealed in the early 1830s, and it was established, first presidency, quorum of the 12, and also they said, well, they, went from sort of maybe a special, kind of calling to then the idea of a lay priesthood where anyone, any male from 12 on could be ordained, although really historically it's more complex than that. But in that first section, they're just more or less saying that, the priesthood, that what happened in the early days of the church developed into a structure that is exactly what we have now. And that's their purpose in that first part. Yeah.
I was really surprised by that. I was really surprised by that because they really talked, it really was a Protestant view of priesthood. It was more offices and how it wasn't this power that you get called down from God. It was more just administrative, or at least that's the way they explained it in the essay that I saw.
I think it's interesting that I feel like that in the church, and I've written about this, and my husband and I, we did a book together called Strangers in Paradox, clear back in 1990. And, we've interacted a lot.
No, it's been that long?
I know. I can't believe how old I am, but it's okay. But at any rate, what was I going to say? You distracted me.
I'm sorry.
I think, no, it's okay. I think that
you were talking about offices in the priesthood.
Yeah,
and we wrote a book together.
I think that the present church really has, they make a division. I mean, they talk about priesthood being the power of God, but they don't see the power. For them, it's important that the power of God is not separated from offices and callings and hierarchy. Because what they're afraid of is somebody who will have charismatic power, kind of a spiritual power, who doesn't have the office, whether it's a woman or a man. So I don't know if you've ever talked on any of your shows about the Denver Snuffer movement, but, Denver Snuffer really was reacting to the fact that a lot of people feel, let's face it, most church meetings are very boring. We don't have this sort of energized, charismatic power that the priesthood has. And I think the church wants it that way. If you get someone, this will really date me. Maybe, Carrie, you remember him. Do anybody remember George Pace or other speakers from BYU, where you had these really dynamic professors, religion professors, and then they would go on the circuit on the church education system, and they would get a big following. And the leaders hated that. I mean, George Pace got really scolded by Bruce McConkie. I'm really dating myself now, right? Nobody young even knows who Bruce McConkie was.
No, I remember all this. Yeah, no, I know what you're saying.
And in fact, I mean, the person who sort of took over from Bruce McConkie was Packer, who of course was in charge of excommunicating or making sure that the September 6th and myself and a lot of others have been excommunicated. He's dead now too, though. So I don't know who's his successor. Is it Bednar?
I think Bednar.
I think it's Bednar. Mm-hmm.
Maybe Ballard with the excommunication.
Ballard,
Tim Ballard at this point.
Yeah.
That was another person who had the charisma, and not saying he didn't do anything, but he had the charisma, and the church does not like that.
No, they do not like that at all. And so I think that they very much like seeing it neither as sort of a free-floating priesthood like you might have in Protestantism, or a charismatic priesthood where you have, charisma means kind of this gifts of the Spirit, right? Where you're exciting, people feel kind of your spiritual energy. We're supposed to say that we feel the Spirit when we hear general authorities, but I think it's pretty hard.
I feel the yawns.
Yeah. And so then I look at the whole Denver Snuffer movement as a reaction to that, where people, I think this was my experience way back when I used to teach Sunday school. They would just, which actually I was doing at the time of the September 6, 1993, during Paul's excommunication, they released me from my Sunday school teaching when I was absent, but without telling me. But, you know, I always felt when I taught Sunday school that people were just hungry for something different, for something interesting. And, you know, they would say, oh, I just love, you know, you give lessons that I haven't heard I haven't heard since I was, heard every time since I was a kid. So I think they're really afraid of that. And so they really have this idea of focusing more on the hierarchy, the offices, the structure, not, they'll talk about the power of the priesthood, but, they don't want to see anything that's going to disrupt the system.
That will take them out of control. They need
Absolutely, because it's about control.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think in that first section, they're kind of laying out the typical kind of narrative of, and notice the picture. I like the picture that you chose. Was that you, Landon, who chose that picture? The one before that, where we have to have, the angels giving Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery the Melchizedek priesthood. But again, and you see so many pictures in church manuals, even in talks where they're talking, where it's a talk to women, they'll bring in those pictures because it is their line of authority that says we are legitimate. We're the only ones in the world that have the right to give the ordinances to bring you into the celestial kingdom. You have to go through us. You have to go through our priesthood. You can't get it on your own. So I think that's the importance of that first section, is setting out that kind of basic narrative that we've all heard.
Yeah, and notice the importance of the mythological number 3, Peter, James, and John, and then the 3 T's in the word latter, early latter days.
That's the Trinity.
Yeah,
I'm not trying to be
her.
Well, and in fact, I think it's so interesting that, the way they look at God, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and they're very real. The Holy Ghost is this male. The church, if you look on the church website, they really make a big deal of that. I recently wrote an article about Heavenly Mother where I go through the actual scriptural text about the Holy Ghost, and mostly the Holy Ghost is referred to as it. You in the scriptures, you do not have a strong male presence, but the church has that. So yeah, we've got to have, the Godhead is like the first presidency, right?
Amen.
They're the first presidency of heaven.
It's ironic that the early Christian church fathers translated the Hebrew word ruach as feminine, and they believed the Holy Spirit, which also means wind or breath or air, spirit, as female.
Right. Well,
Yes,
ruach.
If there was a true restoration, how did he become a man? That didn't happen till way later.
Maybe we talked about, maybe we'll do another whole session on the Heavenly Mother and the female divine, right? We don't want to get sidetracked on that. But so that's the first one. Go to the second one. And actually, I see this as, in a sense, the crux of, where they gaslight and try to hide all of the evidence. And to say, again, their point is, all of that priesthood sounding language, when Joseph used it, it didn't really mean what it seems like it means. It was only, he did not really ordain women. He did not promise them the priesthood. It was all about, really referring to the endowment and, what they were going to have when they are sealed in the temple. So they really try to downplay all of, any of the priesthood language. So in my critique, I go back and bring in other sources to show how my point sort of in this part is that you can find statements that reinforce that Joseph Smith really meant priesthood, and that his language where he talks about the fullness of the priesthood, the fullness of the Melchizedek priesthood, that he connects the language of, the fullness of the priesthood with what you get in the temple. So that's very important.
Can I read one of your comments real quick on page 327?
Yeah.
I really like this. That's right in line with this, where you say, because the church essay presents only documents and arguments supporting the view that only men have the right to priesthood offices and to govern the church, the essay misrepresents information anachronistically to compel the conclusion. And this is their style. They compel the conclusion that the view of current LDS church leaders on the question of women and the priesthood is identical to Joseph Smith's.
Right. And I have I have 6 things where I say, look, these are all the 6 areas of omitted evidence, and they will not look at any contrary opinions.
Yeah. 6 areas, you guys. I want to emphasize to my audience, Margaret uncovered 6 areas in this short essay where the church deliberately omits the historical contextual evidence. So
that is so unlike them. That is so unlike them.
Why would that happen?
Context, right? I mean, I don't know if we want to come back. I think we should come back to those, because actually one of the things I want to make sure that we talk about in the Joseph Smith and Nauvoo Relief Society, and I talk about it in a couple of different places in the essay. And this is my essay is long, and I have like 103 footnotes and lots of sources.
And I check those as often as I can, and that's why we have.
I mean, scholars, you can always argue over everything, right? I mean, that's scholars. But on the other hand, what I try to do is, I think I have sufficient evidence that challenges that statement that you just made, Carrie, that you were reading from my essay. It challenges it. And I think I want to bring this up now. Part of this insidiousness that I see is something that happened. So one thing that contextualizes Joseph Smith's statements to the Relief Society in Nauvoo, I've already quoted some of those. I'm going to make you a kingdom of priests. You need to organize in the order of the priesthood. I turn the key to you. All these statements that are very strong, that they try to say, oh, it doesn't really mean anything to do with actual priesthood, blah, blah, blah. The Relief Society was never supposed to be a priesthood organization. For me, one of the strongest things that gives a contextualization for what Joseph Smith meant is the interpretation of some of the women who were there in Nauvoo when he gave the discourses. And the 3 women that I quote are Sarah Granger Kimball, Bathsheba Smith, and Eliza R. Snow. And I love Laurel Thacker Ulrich documented this, that Eliza R. Snow, who had taken the minutes, she would carry them around with her when she went and visited the women in the different stakes in Utah. And she would sort of like pull them out and say, these were the promises that Joseph Smith gave us.
Oh, how interesting.
How dramatic.
That was really interesting.
You don't find women doing that with the men's stuff today, do you?
Yeah, Eliza really had a unique view from all other women almost in the church. When you read a lot of her stuff, you just go, wow, she's really a different.
Well, and I think, though, the interesting thing is that Bathsheba Smith and Sarah Granger, Smith, all 3 of them with Eliza, they were all Relief Society presidents at one time. And that in 1892, when you had the Jubilee celebration of the beginning of the Relief Society, Sarah Kimball went back and looked at them, and they put in the Woman's Exponent. Now, I don't know if you've heard of the Woman's Exponent, but it started, and suddenly I'll forget exactly when it started, but I think it started in the 1860s, 1870s in Salt Lake City, and it was a woman-run publication. I love the fact called the Woman's Exponent. So what was the Exponent? They were promoting the rights of women. So at the top of every one of their issues, it said, for the rights of the women of Zion and all the world. That was their motto, that they were they were, arguing and promoting the rights of women in the church and all over the world. But in 1892, Sarah Granger Smith went back and she kind of revived I guess she got, out of the hands of Eliza for a while and put it up in the Exponent too. And, sort of restated, here are the promises of Joseph Smith to the women. And so she did that in 1892. In 1905, Bathsheba Smith renewed that idea again in the Exponent. Yeah. And she said, you could find those, Carrie. And she says a couple of things where Bathsheba says, Joseph Smith gave us everything. He gave us every order of the priesthood. Yeah. And gave us, every order of the priesthood. And, she repeats this idea. And I think this is interesting. He promised us that we would be a kingdom. And she uses priestesses instead of priests, he uses priests. She uses priestesses. But I think that's because in her mind, they were made priestesses in the temple. And therefore, that was the fulfillment of Joseph Smith. Well, Bathsheba Smith in the Exponent makes all of these strong statements. And then like less than a year later, suddenly there are these little things where they're
rewriting the endowment.
They give like a correction. It's not like they say, oh, we were wrong, but they say, and then the two big things that they correct, and this is really important, that in the original meeting minutes, Joseph Smith said, I now turn the key to you. And they now said, it was supposed to be, I turn the key in your behalf, which is how B.H. Roberts had changed it. He changed that in the history of the church. And you couldn't find the original until 1980 when Ehud and Cook, did the words of Joseph. And I want to talk about the other thing is that Joseph said the Relief Society was called in the order of the priesthood. And now they changed it to by the order of the priesthood. So maybe those seem too subtle to us now, but I think they're extremely significant. And the women knew they were.
I was just going to say, you noted that how some of the women of that day reacted too. Can I add to this?
Please. Yeah, that's a great book.
Oh, this is a wonderful book. The development of LDS. This is by Devery Anderson.
Devery Anderson, yeah.
The documentary history.
He gives some really important documents for all of this.
I want to show you this picture real quick. This is the first presidency of the Relief Society, and I am choosing my words correctly here. And under the caption, I want to turn away real quick so I can read this correctly. This was November 8th, 1852, and this was Elizabeth Ann Whitney and Eliza R. Snow, and Emmeline B. Wells, the wife of First Presidency Counselor Daniel H. Wells. He referred to his wife's work in the temple as officiating in the character of a priestess. And I want to show you that. I want to show you that caption close enough that you can read it so that you can see I'm not just kidding. That very last line. And that's how some of the prominent brethren in Brigham Young's day, Joseph Smith had been gone for 8 years, but they still referred to that. So I think that's kind of, besides, is that not a cool historic photograph?
Yeah, it is. And by the way, another picture, and I think I want to talk about the significance of those two little changes that seem small, but they're enormous. There was a picture, and I could not find my book. Maybe you have it, Carrie. It's called The Ordained Women Movement. It's put out by Colford Books. And I have an essay in there where I have a whole chronology of everything pertaining. Anyway, I put in that book a picture from the cover of a 1930 Relief Society magazine. It's a drawing where you have Joseph Smith holding this big key and two women, and they quote the original version, which is really interesting, of I now turn the key to you, and this society will now rejoice and things are going to be better for you. Where Joseph Smith, it's a great picture. I was looking for it. I don't know where I put that damn book. Oh, I did swear.
Probably threw it.
I probably, no, I wasn't. That's a good book.
Okay. Yeah.
There's this great picture where he's giving them the key. And I think that's significant for two reasons. The word key in Mormonism is connected to priesthood power. And in the church essay, they tried to say, oh, Joseph Smith was just using that word really loosely. He wasn't that precise with the way he used language. But I think that it is exactly precise and important in two ways. He's giving the women, and the idea is he gives it to them. He doesn't go and open the door for them. He gives them the key so that they can open the door. And so it's to them. The key, this is a key of priesthood that belongs to the women. It doesn't belong to the men. And I think that's very significant. And you better believe that B.H. Roberts knew, and so did, I was going to say something really bad.
Say it.
Joseph Smith.
Joseph.
We all say that here. We all use that term.
B.H. Roberts, Joseph F. Smith, they knew that Joseph had, they knew better, and they purposely changed it and wanted to take away any of the power from the Relief Society. Yeah. And of course, then Harold B. Lee finished the thing. He put the whole thing in a coffin in the 1970s with the correlation program. Before that, the Relief Society was not what it had been under like Eliza Snow or Bathsheba Smith or Sarah Kimball. But they did have their own organization. They had their own money. They had their own publication. You could argue that it was kind of insipid, but they did it. It was them. It was not under the priesthood.
Yeah. So, can I read this entry?
Yeah, please read that, Carrie. Yeah.
The American Prophets Record. I entirely agree with you on the words of Joseph Smith. What I did when I first got that book is I compared it immediately to Joseph Fielding Smith's.
Exactly. He changed everything in the teachings of the prophet.
That's close to crooked what he did to the teachings.
Oh, it's dishonest. Let's say it's not just that they gaslight. They are dishonest.
It's unfortunate we have to say that, but the evidence is overwhelming. Here's what the actual journal of Joseph Smith said on the 28th of April, 1842. At 2:00 p.m., I met members of the Female Relief Society, and after presiding at the admission of many new members, gave a lecture on the priesthood, shewing how the sisters would come in possession of the privileges, blessings, and gifts of the priesthood, and that the signs should follow them as healing the sick, casting out the devils, and that they might attain unto these blessings by a virtuous life and conversation and diligence in keeping all the commandments. Like you said, he didn't open the door. He gave them the key, but he said, here's what's going to happen.
And it was a priesthood key, and that's important.
And it was the priesthood.
And the church now denies that. They say Joseph Smith never gave women any priesthood keys. And I just think that it's because they're buying into the lie. The second thing where they changed the wording, and it's, again, B.H. Roberts, Joseph F. Smith, that it was originally they were called in the order of the priesthood, and Joseph told them you should organize and move according to the order of the priesthood. And also Bathsheba Smith says, Joseph said that until the Relief Society was organized in the order of the priesthood, that the church would never be right. And I think that is a phenomenal statement. The idea that if you don't have women exercising priesthood and having control over their organization, and we'll talk later about the anointed quorum, because I think it wasn't just that, they had their own thing and then the men had their own thing, because Joseph Smith had a quorum where men and women met together and the highest quorum of the church.
In their second anointings.
Yes.
But, that's in your essay in Maxine Hanks.
That's in that essay too that I have in there. But I think that the idea that you're called by the order of the priesthood rather than in the order of the priesthood. So it means, again, the way they changed it was to say, oh, you're only subordinate to the priesthood, the male priesthood. You don't have your own. But Bathsheba Smith makes it very clear that that's not how she interpreted that. And I think it's really interesting for me, that historical contextualization of how the women like Eliza Snow or Bathsheba Smith or Sarah Kimball saw this is really important. It's really crucial. And, you know, they don't give you any contextualization. They just say, oh, believe what we tell you. So that's a really important thing.
In the church essay. You're not saying that about Bathsheba Smith and Eliza.
No. I'm saying Bathsheba Smith. They don't bring in her. In fact, I think I'm one of the few who have brought in her to, as a context for interpreting the Relief Society minutes. So I think I bring in the context. I bring in Bathsheba Smith and these other women because they are witnesses.
Yes.
They were there and they knew what they had been given. And I mean, the question of why did they give in to these men?
Well, it's interesting. You even said here, the leading sisters, page 415 in her essay in Maxie Hanks.
Oh, that one, yeah.
You said the leading sisters such as Eliza R. Snow and Sarah M. Kimball did organize some Utah Relief Societies with priestesses, teachers, deacons, and it went through. That's fascinating. So they were organizing their women's organization, which Joseph Smith said to. He told Emma, well, you go ahead and pick your own counselors and officers and stuff like that. I'm not going to do that for you. So, yeah, that's real interesting.
Yeah, it is. So I don't know if you want to go now, Landon, to the next part, and we can come back to some of this and kind of. So, I mean, to me, this is really that whole section on the Relief Society is probably the pivotal point where they distort, they lie about what the historical documents say. They cover it over. And so what my essay does is I bring in these 6 big areas where, you know, they eliminate the evidence. And so you could go to those next and we can talk about some of those. So we've kind of talked a little bit about, well, he gave contemporary statements like the one you read, Carrie, from the manuscript history or from that book that shows that he saw it as him giving a lecture on priesthood. But also his contemporary statements also contextualize how he saw the Melchizedek priesthood connected to the temple. So the full instructions, that's the next one. I go through all of these. Let me see what I have here. So then the next one, the number 3 was his statements about the fullness of the priesthood, Elijah and the temple. That
was interesting. I loved that part, man.
Yeah, and I think.
Oh wow.
Number 4.
I've had Charlie Harrell on with the.
Is there a part you wanted to read from that, Carrie? But I think the interesting thing is, and this shows how he's thinking of priesthood in a different way than the church says today.
Absolutely. I've got the statement if you want me to read it.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and read it?
Yeah, this is great. This is in this book, you guys, the Gospel Topics series. I'm going to quote it's on 343 and 344. This was really cool. Okay, and so official LDS doctrine claims that the restoration of the priesthood in the church centers on the angelic visitations of John the Baptist and Peter, James, and John, and that Elijah only has to do with sealing ordinances. Okay, I promised you we would open your eyes. Listen to what Dr. Toscano says now.
This is a quote, right?
Yes, but Joseph Smith said differently. Again, she's using Joseph Smith. Now, here's what he said. Now for Elijah, the spirit, the power, and calling of Elijah is that ye have power to hold the key to the revelations, ordinances, oracles, powers, and endowments of the fullness of the Melchizedek priesthood and of the kingdom of God on earth, and to receive, obtain, and perform all the ordinances belonging to the kingdom of God.
Right.
That's pretty all inclusive. That quote is
Right.
amazing. That's in Wilford Woodruff's journal. Now, you can't tell me that the church is not familiar with Wilford Woodruff's journal, for Pete's sake. But
Yeah,
they
and
omit it.
I can't remember. I think I might have it in a footnote here. Actually, in 1839, Joseph Smith said that the fullness that the priesthood had not been completely restored yet, and of course that goes completely against
Yeah, it wouldn't
the
happen.
church narrative of Peter, James, and John, right? And he's saying in 1839, it's not complete yet. We're not done with it. And I think he was referring to, you already had the visitation of Elijah, but he's referring to that until you have the highest order of the priesthood bestowed in the temple, and until you have women functioning with men in the anointed quorum, that it's not complete.
And this is your very next point on page 344. That's what you're saying. You're saying the actual fullness of the Melchizedek priesthood is that what is associated with that temple endowment, and both the men and the women put the robe on the right shoulder for the fullness of the Melchizedek priesthood. They were given that priesthood in the endowment, folks. That's how it is. That's what they didn't put in.
No, and another kind of contextualization is that you have statements. You have really strong statements from Joseph Smith that I think clearly connect the fullness of the priesthood with the temple endowment. So, again, I have lots of evidence if you want to go and look at my essay. But I think it's interesting that you have statements by both Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball that reinforce that. And Brigham Young, I'm quoting something he said that he recorded in his diary that his wife, Mary A. Young, was admitted to the highest order of the priesthood on November 1st, 1843. So the idea that she was admitted to the highest order of the priesthood, and it was, connected to both the endowment and also the second anointing. You can get into debates about whether or not you have the fullness of the priesthood with just the endowment versus the second anointing. I actually think this is a theological. I think the endowment itself gave that.
You said in the footnote 72, the second anointings did not bestow priesthood, but it sealed all priesthood blessings and provisions.
Yeah, that, again, you can have people argue with me, but that's how I interpret it.
Yeah,
Landon, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say that's an interesting point because, as men, you can't go into the temple until you have the Melchizedek priesthood. Yet women can. So if priesthood is a requirement to go in the temple, then it should be for everybody or nobody. The men should be able to go in without the Melchizedek priesthood if the women can, if it's not a requirement of the temple, it would seem.
Yeah, and I think I think it's interesting. I think I said this in my original article about my article called Missing Rib, where I think that Joseph Smith saw the women going through, for some reason, they went through and got the ordinances. They didn't have to have. Sometimes I call the kind of church priesthood the provisional priesthood, that the men had the provisional priesthood, but the women got the fullness when they went to the temple. But of course, then the argument is, I believe, and here's where there's huge discussion, they deny it in their next section on temple. I think that from Joseph Smith's theology, if you have the fullness of the priesthood, you actually have the right to participate in, you saw it in that quote, right, Carrie? To participate in any of the ordinances, which is not just the temple ordinances, but I would argue any of the church ordinances that you
and pertaining to the kingdom of God on earth. Well, what's that?
Yeah, exactly. And of course they say, no, absolutely not. Now you could argue, because of the order of the church, you could say an endowed woman could say, well, I have the priesthood. I have the fullness of the priesthood. I have the Melchizedek priesthood. But even men, you can't do things in the church without permission from the leaders.
Right.
The big thing, and this is, of course, they also want to say that, you can't just go out and baptize your kids without, even if you're a Melchizedek priesthood holder, you have to get permission, from the bishop and the leaders and everything. But I think theologically you could argue maybe differently. And I think that's where Denver Snuffer goes. He kind of says there's a power of God that gives you authority that's apart from the church. And of course they hate that, but it is really interesting. Yeah.
Am I going to take your thunder if I quote this next part on
no, we don't want to just hear my voice going on and on, right?
Oh yeah, we do.
We do. Oh, okay.
We're loving what you're telling us, man. Well, just to let you know that on this
I have my priestess voice
on. On this theme on the second anointed, you're talking about Joseph and Emma, and again, here's where they're somewhat manipulating the historical record, where you say the event happened September 28th, 1843. The minutes of the quorum of the anointed, where Barak El, which is a name Joseph Smith often went by, was by common consent and unanimous voice chosen president of the quorum and anointed and ordained to the highest and the holiest order of the priesthood and companion ditto. And that's been removed, you guys.
Oh, I know.
Some instances. And you're going, holy mackerel.
You have a direct record that says she was ordained to the priesthood. And of course, that's what their essay says. No woman was ever ordained. Joseph Smith and no one else ever ordained a woman to any kind of priesthood. And so, again, they're hiding the record. By the way, you have the one book by Devery Anderson. He's great. But there's a book that he and Gary
He has the Quorum of the Anointed, doesn't he?
Yeah, the Quorum of the Anointed. And they have some really good documents in there. And in fact, I'm just going to go ahead and jump to this.
Sure.
And that is that there is evidence. So we are number 5, her anointing ordination to the highest priesthood. And she is also, because of that document, it's like she and Joseph together are the co-presidents of the anointed quorum.
Can you explain this anointed quorum?
Some disagree with me on that, but I think the evidence is there. What were you going to say, Landon?
Can you describe this anointed quorum? I hadn't really heard of it till I read your essay.
Yeah. So, and again, the people who really have all the, I've read all the stuff. So even before their book came out, I'd read all the stuff. But Anderson and Bajera have the book where you can just really get all the documents. But evidently, in the basically last year of his life, so Emma is anointed along with Joseph to the highest order of the priesthood, and they are presidents of the Quorum of the Anointed. So what the Quorum of the Anointed was a group of men and women who had been anointed to the highest order of the priesthood, and they were called the Quorum of the Anointed. Now, some people say, well, they were not a real priesthood quorum. They were just like a prayer group or something. And they were sometimes called, there were other titles they went by, but certainly the Anointed Quorum was one of the titles.
Yeah, and Holy Order, Quorum of the Anointed, or simply Quorum is what you say.
Yeah, they were called the Quorum too. And they met a few times in the last year of Joseph Smith's life. So the big debate among scholars, and actually I proposed that it was a real priesthood quorum when I gave my initial Sunstone talk in 1984. Later, Mike Quinn agrees with me, and he gives a lot of evidence in the book that I quote in there in one of his hierarchy books. But he agrees with me. Originally, he had called it only a prayer quorum, and then he changed his mind, and it went to he calls it a real priesthood quorum, where they voted. They talked about church business. Really, women didn't have much of a voice, let's face it, but they were there. And the idea was that you had to have both men and women. Interestingly, after Joseph Smith died, so it was a group of men and women. They'd all been anointed to the fullness of the priesthood. They did meet. They were called a quorum. They did deal with church issues. Didn't meet a lot of times. It's just in that last year. When Joseph died, Brigham Young and some of the other men,
C. Kimball,
they used membership in the quorum as their justification why they have the right to the succession to Joseph Smith.
Instead of Sidney Rigdon.
Yeah, instead of Sidney Rigdon. And I mean, I think that's fascinating. Interestingly, I think Brigham Young sort of knew this. You could argue that Emma Smith had the right.
I was just going to say that as the co-president of the highest quorum, she would be the successor.
I don't think she
understood. Do you think that's what caused the rift between, I mean, Brigham Young?
Rivalry, absolutely.
But I mean, I think she, from my reading, I think she had the right to the presidency, and that she. But I think I'm not sure she understood. We don't have any documentation. I think Brigham Young understood. And by the way, they dissolved the anointed quorum. Mm-hmm. So you go from anointed quorum being the highest quorum to the 12 apostles, and that was the thing that Joseph Smith and Heber C. Kimball wanted. They wanted the apostles to have the power of determining the presidency.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. You just blew my mind. Cause the highest quorum, it could have been a woman who took over at the end.
Could have been Emma.
But
the church would be so different.
Yeah. Brigham Young, this is a threat to him. Get rid of it quickly.
Yeah. No wonder he said, down to hell, Emma. That's right. Of course.
Well, and I think
that's
interesting
why
is that not only do you have the disbanding of the anointed quorum, but you move the power from the anointed quorum to the quorum of the 12, which also kind of puts Sidney Rigdon on the outs too. And I think that they used the anointed quorum as their justification. They had more priesthood than Sidney Rigdon did, is what Brigham and Heber are arguing. But you then have also Brigham Young disbanding the Relief Society for 20 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is really significant too.
Yes, they never mentioned that either, did it?
No.
And that's a huge threat. Huge threat. Right
so
there.
I actually think going back to why did Bathsheba and Eliza give in to them? When they had that argument between 1892 and 1910 or something. I think it's because there was the threat of the disbanding again, and they were not going to give up they built a lot. They had built up a really strong Relief Society, and they were not about to and they did have control of it. They weren't allowed to call it a priesthood quorum, but they had control of the Relief Society, and they did exercise spiritual gifts, which were very important to them.
Well, that's too bad, because it was in the brethren were so distracted with all of the 1911 and 12 Reverend Spalding attacking the Book of Abraham too. Man, if the women would have recognized how distracted the guys had gotten, they might have been able to do something. I don't know.
I think the women. Oh, go ahead, Landon.
Women were in leadership roles in this time in that area. The Christian Science. What's the name of the
Mary
gal?
Baker Eddy?
Yes. She was the leader of a church, so this wouldn't have been a completely unforeseen thing.
Unheard of.
The other thing that I think was distracting the women is they were very involved in the suffrage movement. You had the leaders of the Relief Society, like Emma Wells, were in contact with the leaders of the suffrage movement, and they were really working for women's suffrage.
Yeah,
and I don't think they wanted that undermined, and so I think they made the sacrifice.
Yeah.
They said, we have to hold on to what we have. We can't give up our power in the Relief Society. The suffrage movement is really important. We have they had their own storehouse and granary and magazine and funds. We're not going to give up that. So they gave up the notion that it was a priesthood quorum.
Yeah, that makes sense.
What's funny here is that these very arguments that you're making and they're being shot down, when the church finally has to give the women the priesthood or lose all of their people, they're going to use these same arguments to justify why they're bringing it back.
This is where they'll go. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And of course, the thing that makes me mad is that they'll blame past leaders like, Brigham Young was racist, right? But they never want to they admit that they have been racist.
Right.
And the thing that makes me even more mad is they always want to blame God. Well, God told us not to give the blacks the priesthood. And actually, back to the argument you were using, Landon, about the notion that men have to be ordained to priesthood before they can go to the temple, but women don't. But notice, women of African American descent could not go to the temple until black men were allowed to be ordained. And I think that also supports the notion that they knew very well that the temple has a priesthood element to it.
Very
It's
interesting.
not just about sealings.
Nice touch. Yeah. How interesting.
Yeah.
You're good. I'm not kidding.
Oh, yeah, I'm pretty good, aren't I?
You are. I'm loving this,
I mean,
man.
I've only been thinking, and again, I'm not saying that my interpretation is absolutely right, but I've been reading and thinking about this stuff for 40 years and trying to dig up all the documents and so forth. And I really it doesn't sound like it when you read my essay, because I think I try to keep an even tone other than you guys are gaslighting. But when I read their essay, I got so upset. It was like, you guys are lying. You are lying. And, and you act so nice, right? And and that kind of leads to the last section. If you go back to our list, Brandon, where they claim that the temple only has to do with sealings, that. And I think it's interesting that, I've had for years women telling me,
I'll be right back.
Obvious that it seems obvious that in the temple, women have some kind of priesthood. I mean, you wear the robes of the priesthood, you have the signs and tokens of the priesthood, you wear the garments, wear all of this. And then they try to undercut that all and say, oh, no, that's not really priesthood, right? That's just connected to how you're going to be sealed, as a couple. And I mean, to me, it's not just that they're lying, but also it's, again, this gaslighting where they try to go, oh, no. Anybody who thinks that there's any priesthood bestowed in the temple, or that Joseph Smith gave women priesthood, they're just misguided. They just misunderstand. You've got to listen to us leaders. We're going to give you the real interpretation here. And, I just see that that's very insidious. And telling the members they can't trust their own either spiritual or intellectual inclinations or reactions to things, which I think is. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say real reactions, because that is the sense you get when you go into the temple. Things are equal, it seems, in the way that you dress and the ordinances that you're going through and the actions that you take, and you get that sense, and then you're told, oh, you completely misunderstood, you're so far off base. And you're right, your intuition says no, but I agree, eventually in the future these are exactly the things that they'll point to say, oh no, you were right, you misunderstood that you didn't misunderstand, but you did. So again, it'll be gaslighting in reverse for the exact opposite result.
And of course, they will never go back and acknowledge that I was right about anything, right? Mm-mm. Or that, my excommunication, I was excommunicated for both the Maxine Hanks book you held up, where I have I think a very important essay in there, where I talk about both women in priesthood and the Heavenly Mother and connect them. Those were the two things I got in trouble for. Although bottom line, and I think this is really important because this goes back to what I'm challenging them on in my essay. The bottom line, I was threatened in July of 1993, and they said, you may not speak, discuss, write, or publish anything to do with church history or doctrine, or we will hold a church disciplinary council on you with the possibility of excommunication. In other words, they were asking me to be completely silent. And I said, no, I won't do it. Now, there's a long history of why it took them a while to kind of come around and ex me. They didn't do it until 2000. Partly there were two bishops that refused and all sorts of other things. But interestingly, when it came down to it, they would not argue with me about my writings. If in my excommunication court, if ever I would try to bring up a strong argument, the stake president would say to me, interrupt me mid-sentence, you are not allowed to use that argument. that argument will not be allowed. You can only speak how and when we let you here.
Court of love.
All you had to
Margaret.
do was say, "I rest my case on the priesthood."
I rest my case. Oh,
You know what I was excommunicated for? The way they defined apostasy was I had been warned by church leaders that I shouldn't speak or publish. I disobeyed them. Therefore, I have spoken ill of the Lord's anointed, and I'm an apostate because I did not obey church leaders. So they wouldn't even base it on my teachings. They didn't say your teachings are wrong. They said you were disobedient. You were told to be quiet. You weren't. Therefore, you are an apostate and you deserve to be excommunicated. Of course, they did
about power.
They did tell me in the court, well, we have to excommunicate you because we don't want anybody to believe you.
They said that.
They actually said that in the.
Okay. Let me just say for my wonderful audience, then, now you know who to go to learn from, right? For real, everyone who's been.
I don't claim to be the only one. I know that Dan Vogel was. I think he still is in the audience, and he might disagree with me on a lot of stuff. But that's the fun of scholarship. I think the important thing is that we have the documents out there. And and the context, and we're looking at a historical context. We're looking at documents. We can interpret them differently, but to hide documents, to lie about them, to gaslight, I mean, that is so destructive to everybody. And and the church, they will do an about face and then pretend like they never, did anything different, and they'll never apologize to somebody who.
Well, they come along now and said, well, we've always been talking about that. You're just lazy learners and, bad studiers, gospel studiers and stuff.
And we're so sorry that you got excommunicated for something that now we routinely teach, right? And we've always said that. That's what's crazy to me. And I when we were talking to Margaret before, she mentioned that this council were literally 16 men and you. Where else does that happen? It's just
talk about a court
insidious.
Insidious. We need to make a T-shirt.
Sounds like a pirate song. 16 men on an apostate's board.
On apostate's board. Yo ho ho, and you are axed.
Yo ho ho, and a bottle of rum.
That's right. Oh.
Well, and in fact, one funny thing that happened in this court of love, right? And is that at one point when I was arguing about, and this was before women were allowed to counsel or be on different committees and so forth, and I was even even now, again, you don't have men, you only have men on these disciplinary councils, and I was saying, is it really fair? Wouldn't it be better if we had women participating? So we had women's points of view. I said, I think a lot of women can be very intimidated when they face, this all male group, especially if they've been abused. And they all were all nervous about, well, you don't think we're intimidating you, do you?
No, it's only 16-1. Obviously, you can't handle me one-on-one.
No, I know. And I felt like that. I said, well, you know what? I'm a professor, and I have to deal with, disagreements and all kinds of, I presented papers at conferences and so forth. But you know what? I said, it obviously isn't fair. I mean, women's voices are disregarded on every level of the church. Yeah. And they were so defensive, right?
Defensive because they knew you were saying the truth. Otherwise, why would they react that way?
Well, and one of the funny things about the court was that when we were done and they announced that I was excommunicated, at the very end, I had not been going to church for several years, so I didn't know any of these people. But I went. Some people don't go to a church court and others do, and I respect individual choices. But I went because I wanted them to have to face me. I didn't want to let them off easy.
Very good.
But at the end, they said to me, they all wanted to shake my hand. It was really kind of bizarre. You've just excluded me from the celestial kingdom, told me that I'm an outcast. And now you wanted to shake my hand and say,
Well,
we were so impressed. You're so nice. You're so smart. I don't know. They were expecting to have a ranting feminist or something, but
you should have told them you're so stupid.
Rebecca gets that a lot whenever we go to when they find out she's post-Mormon, because she's always so kind and nice, and everyone's expecting these raging ex-Mormon burn you down mob, and she always treats them so nice. It's always funny to watch.
Yeah, it's even more dangerous to be intelligent, though. Sorry, I have to say
they're very intimidated by intelligent women. There's no question.
Intelligence is intimidating to someone who wants to present the idea, the image that they are intelligent. But intelligence can demonstrate when you are the real thing and when you aren't. I suggest that's why they're intimidated. Honestly, I'm not trying to disparage or ad hominem any of the brethren, but I happen to know I'm much better at the Hebrew and the Old Testament than all of them combined, and yet they call me the lazy learner. You know what I mean?
I think they were really. I think they were really shaking your hand, saying, "Congratulations, you're the smartest person we've ever excommunicated."
Can I get a selfie?
I have to give my husband credit for one of the greatest lines in all Mormon discourse. So I didn't want him to go with me. I didn't take any witnesses. I just wanted to go and face them and so forth. But when I went home and described this kind of bizarre thing about how, they were also nice at the end after they'd ex me, he made this famous statement. He said, "It sounds like you were gang raped by the Care Bears."
Oh, I'm writing that one down.
I've quoted him. He's a very funny man. But it's true. It
was
bizarre.
Hey, do you think he'd ever come on one of these with us?
Yeah, I think he would.
That would be fun to have the both of you.
That would be incredible.
Paul is very, he was excommunicated basically because he insulted them. He was very harsh on the church hierarchy for being more concerned about corporate power than the love of God, and that they don't preach the real gospel. They only teach obedience, pray, pay, and obey, right?
And that's nothing but truth.
And he was very critical of them and insulted them.
Yeah.
Which they can't take. But I think it's really interesting because they don't want criticism. Apostasy is if you disagree with them. If you show their flaws and you disagree with them, then you're an apostate.
Yeah.
And this whole essay, and I would encourage people, I hope they'll read my essay. It has a lot of notes. It's really detailed, but I think the information is important because, again, it throws it all back in their face. You use Joseph Smith to justify your hierarchy and your power and your authority, but you do not line up with what he said.
Yeah. You use him, but at the same time, you ignore him. That's crazy.
Absolutely.
It's
which is
like
what they do with all the, it doesn't matter whether it's the scriptures. They're only, I love the fact now that they're not like encourage you to read the whole scriptures. We'll just give you the little passages we want you to, to read, right?
Exactly.
No need for context.
No context.
None at all. We frown on context. That's right.
Yeah.
We frown on context. Sign. Hey, that
signed the first presidency, right?
The first. We might have come up with about 15 new T-shirt slogans here. You guys.
We got to do it, Carrie. We got to do it. So I have to ask you a question. Do you see it, Margaret, going like the Priesthood ban, where they were able to dial it back very quickly by exactly that, going back and reworking, the statements that they had previously undone, putting them back. And then it was pretty easy to show that it was okay to undo the ban. Yeah. Do you see it going that way at all with women?
I think if they change it, it will. But I do not see them. I said this to you guys when we met earlier. I do not see them changing this soon. because I feel like that the male control of the priesthood is so connected to their identity as men that, and this is not true with all men at all. In fact, I've talked to so many men who would welcome the ordination of women. Yeah, you would. I think there are a lot of men, even men that are active in the church, who would welcome the ordination of women. And, you know, it would be a big burden off men that they're not bearing the whole burden of priesthood, right?
Yeah, there'd be more women to set up chairs.
And I think especially younger men, you know, anybody younger than 40 usually.
Yeah.
But I think these old guys just hang on to this as such a part of their power and authority and identity that I think it'll be really hard for them to give it up. And because of the whole way that succession happens, it's so hard for, I mean, I see the Spencer Kimball was sort of a miracle, and he only could have made the change with the blacks in the priesthood when Mark Peterson was out of town. He took the vote, you know, when Mark Peterson was out of town.
And Staples was in the hospital, yeah.
So political, yep.
Yeah, everybody that was going to oppose. So it could happen, but I think that there's so much resistance to it. And I think this essay proves it, how much resistance there is.
I actually have talked to a lot of women who said, if they give the women the priesthood, I'm out. Because I've spent so long being told that I wasn't supposed to get it. If all of a sudden I'm supposed to get it, I'm going to be going, why haven't I had it the whole time?
But Margaret's essay in this book by Max Hanks, I don't know how easy this book is to get, but Margaret does explain why that's not actually the best option. Also, I
think it's really interesting. I mean, maybe I don't make it clear enough in that book, Carrie, but I actually believe that women should be ordained to priesthood in the church. I think that women do have.
Right. Oh, you did make that clear.
But I think that I think it's absolutely necessary for them to be ordained to priesthood in the church, and I want them in all of the councils. You know, what I don't want is for women to suddenly, okay, we're ordained, but you've got to kind of take years to work up to, we're going to finally get you into the Council of the 12. And of course, we've seen that with racial issues. I mean, how long has it taken them to get anybody other than an old white guy, you know, into the quorum of the 12? And so I don't see them doing that soon, but it could happen. And if it does, Rebecca, I totally agree with you that it'll be, oh yeah, there were always, you know, we weren't really that opposed to it. You know, we had to wait for God's approval.
Of course. We don't know why God didn't want it.
Yeah. Going to blame God, you know, we were only waiting on him because we're so open to the Spirit, right?
God will blame Mother in Heaven.
That's right. It was Mother in Heaven.
Get blamed.
Hey, can I ask?
You go ahead, Carrie. And then I wanted to say something else in response to what Landon said.
One of the books that changed my entire perception of gender issues was Rianne Eisler's The Chalice and the Blade. Have you read that one?
I have. It's been a long time. It's a long time ago.
It's an old book. But she really showed me how you can't ignore half of humanity and succeed. And she wasn't talking about just religion, but she was talking about politics as well. And the way she made her case was I remember when it switched in my mind reading her book, I thought it would only benefit if women had the priesthood then.
Yeah, and I mean, you probably read that a long time ago because it's an old book. But I think, again, anybody who's younger, because of the way, you know, society has changed.
Oh, sure.
Obviously, we still have patriarchy, right? But, you know, I mean, you know, when I was young, it was unusual to have women professors, right? Now, most of the professors in my language department, well, I think we have more women than we do men. Things have changed. So I think younger people, they're used to that. But I think it's interesting, back to what you were saying, Landon, I find, because I've been talking to people about this and trying to get a feel for how people respond, you know, for the last 40 years, since the 80s when I first published on it. And you have some men who are really positive about women being ordained, and some women who are really against it, like you said, Landon. And it was sort of like they will feel betrayed on some level, because they thought I squelched all of my inclination toward that. I was obedient. And now suddenly you're telling me, what did I do that for? What was my sacrifice for? It was for nothing. And I've talked to a lot of women, or the other thing that women say is, I don't want the responsibility of the priesthood. I don't want to abuse priesthood. I don't want to judge anybody else. So I'd rather not have it, because I'd rather not have the burden of that responsibility. So I think it's so interesting. There are a lot of different kinds of responses that people have.
Yeah, there's more dynamic. Yeah.
One thing I see is that if women are supposed to have the priesthood equal with men, God certainly would have known that, because that's how his relationship should be. And it should not have taken the entire history of the world for him to finally say, now it's time. This should have been there all along. And
well, that's what Gordon Hinckley argued back on one of his interviews. I think one with who was it? One
Larry,
of his
Larry King. Yeah,
it was either Larry King or he did another one too. That's what he said. Well, it's always been God's pattern that only men have priesthood. So he kind of used this big, long historical argument.
And he's wrong, because biblically in the New Testament, there were women who had the priesthood.
Yeah.
And there are, so there's the big argument. But I definitely
he was historically a lazy learner.
Yeah, I think Junia is an apostle in
absolutely.
And you have deaconess,
Phoebe and others.
Phoebe and Junia and others, and and there are several really good books out. I'm not sure I quote them all in my article, because I already had too many footnotes, about other scholars and other religious traditions who have talked about women priests, even within the Catholic tradition. Oh, yes, When Women Were Priests. That's a great book, Carrie. I'm glad you're holding it up. It's a good book. And there are a couple others like that with really good research. And by the way, I was really influenced by a lot of the feminist theologians in other traditions when I first started getting interested in this. There's so many good writings by Catholic women, Protestant women, and so forth. I had the great privilege I think it took place in 2004. I was invited to participate in a conference on women in religion at the Harvard Divinity School. And they had some of the biggest scholars, women like Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, Rosemary Radford Ruther. I've met her a number of times. I think did she die? I think she might have. But they were like the biggest scholars in religious feminism. And I got to speak with them, and I told my story. I got a standing ovation. And it was so great to meet these women. But I had learned so much from all of them: Jewish women, goddess worship women, Protestant women, Catholic women. There's been so much going on for decades on these topics, really good scholars. And I was influenced by a lot of them, as I kind of went through my own search.
Well, I am too, because in my, one of the main factors that got me out of apologetics was because I wanted so bad to be such a well-informed apologist that I jumped into the biblical studies scholarship of other religious traditions. And when I compared Joseph Fitzmyer and Frank Moore Cross and William F. Albright to Mark E. Peterson and Gordon B. Hinckley and Boyd K. Packer, I said, oh my gosh, the difference is between a college professor and kindergarten here. Why aren't we producing the good stuff?
Yeah, well, I had the same, even before I got interested in religious feminism, which happened later. When I was a teenager, and I have to say that in a way I was never the typical believer, because I was a reader. So, when I was 17, I read The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. And so, and I'm reading, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Jane Austen, all of these, great writers. And I remember feeling like reading Dostoevsky and then listening to general conference talks, the difference And I'm not talking scholarship, Carrie. I mean, that came later. I started looking at scholarship because,
Right.
in fact, I decided to learn. I did biblical Hebrew and ancient Greek because I wanted to read all of this myself and to make my own decisions. But even before I started doing that, when I was a teenager, when I read these great thinker like Dostoevsky and his Grand Inquisitor scene in that book where, you know, how can Christ answer the question of why do you let little children suffer?
Yeah.
You know, and the way that he handles that. And then you go to General Conference and they're tackling inanities. It's either inane or it's obedience, right?
Yeah.
And only listen to us. And that was when I first started questioning. It was like that, you know, I could tell there was a problem. So yeah, that for me. I stayed in a long
Proving
time.
contraries, truth is made manifest. I'm quoting Joseph Smith again. There you go.
Yeah.
That's why they don't want you reading anything but church-approved materials, because if you read real literature, you see
it doesn't matter whether you're reading scholarship or whether you're reading the greatest literature that humans have produced. It's a challenge to their claim of they have the corner on all truth.
Well said.
I mean, in my reading from very early, I just discovered not only do they not have the corner, but they're kind of like not that good, even on a elementary level, right?
Yeah.
So
interesting.
Yeah.
Well,
so I don't know what other issues. I mean, we've been talking a long time, but I've been doing most of the talking. Carrie's gotten in some. I don't know if Rebecca and Landon. See, I'm automatically the teacher, you guys.
That's right. Well, and in this case, you know.
Students, which are the other ones? You have your comments that you haven't had a chance yet. Make your
Well,
comments.
I have an observation, and I've mentioned this before. I can't remember if it was on your show or on Mormonish, but this is just kind of an anecdotal scenario kind of for younger members of the church. So before I stepped away, I was a primary teacher. And I remember one year we were giving, the lesson about the priesthood, and I taught 7-year-old girls. And there was, I think, only one boy in the class and the rest were girls. And I was talking about the priesthood, and one girl said, "My cousin just got the priesthood, and I'm so excited to get the priesthood." This little girl said this. And that completely gave me pause, because I thought, well, now that's very interesting. What do I say about that? Is this a moment where it's like Santa isn't real? This little girl thinks she's going to get the priesthood. And I said, well, how many of you think that you will be getting the priesthood someday? And over half of them did raise their hand, which is very telling to me, because what it indicated to me is that in every other area of these little girls' lives, they are never told they can't do something a boy can't do. In fact, I'm guessing that their parents go to great lengths to tell them you can do whatever a boy can do in school or, athletics or music, whatever they're in. And I felt like maybe these parents had never had the priesthood talk with these little girls, because they didn't know they weren't going to get it. No, I mean, it's funny, but it's not funny. It tells me that the younger generation, they can't say that to their girls. They don't know how to explain that to their girls. And they're just kind of letting it slide, maybe hoping they would learn at church. So I kind of went home. I told the kids, well, you go home and talk to your parents about the priesthood. I was not going to be the one to burst that bubble or have the talk with them. I was not. But I just wonder what you all think about that, because again, this is one little class, but in the heart of Utah County, where you would think there would be the most staunch, parents that would be teaching their kids the right way. And these little girls did not know they were not going to get the priesthood. So I found that extremely interesting.
I have a couple of little things in response. I think it's really interesting. Way back, my girls now are like in their 30s and 40s, but way back when we still went to church and my girls were little, there was a meeting where there were blessings of babies. And my daughter, Elizabeth, who was only like about 3 or 4, she said out loud, "Why aren't the mommies up there blessing the babies? They love their babies too." And, for her, it was such a disconnect, So out of the mouth of babes, right? Yeah. But, one of the interesting things, and here's another comment that I'd like to hear from Landon and Carrie, but at the University of Utah, this has been about 10 years ago, but I had a student who I had given a lecture to a class about Mormon women feminist issues. And I asked her, because she was a student in a couple of other my classes, I said, doesn't the position of women bother you in the church? I mean, you're a feminine, you identify as a feminist. Would you put up with the way you're treated in the church in your workplace? And she said, no, I wouldn't. And I said, well, why do you in the church then? And she said, well, in general, it's because I feel good there. It's a nice atmosphere. I feel like I'm kind of, we have a lot of good stuff. So I'm not going to complain. And that was really telling to me, because I thought, what?
But
why?
that's how the essay presents this thing. They give all those little good things. Look at how much we're doing for you women and all that. Right? Interesting.
Yeah.
Margaret, can you cover just a little bit for us guys who we don't go into the endowment rooms for where the women are getting the endowments, so we don't see how this really operates. How does the priesthood in the temple with the women work, and what's your take on, is that priesthood? What authority are they doing that by?
So, I mean, I have to say, where's my sleeveless, right?
Where's your sleeve? That's right.
Shoulders. I can't walk.
Cleavage. So,
Oh my God, Bishop, I'm sorry.
I have, I was excommunicated in 2000. The last time I wore my garments was in 1996 at my father's funeral. But I have not been allowed in the temple since like must have been 81 or 82. And there's all these stories of why Paul and I got excluded. Really abuse of power, I'm telling you. So it's been forever since I've been. I mean, I try to read up and talk to people. I mean, my own experience was that, when I first started getting serious about looking at all the biblical scholarship and the scholarship on Mormonism, which happened that started for me in the late 70s, early 80s. I had an experience in the temple. I decided I wasn't going to get married, and I didn't go on a mission, but I wanted to get my endowments because I was, kind of religiously intense at that point in my life. And I persuaded a bishop to let me do it. And for me, I felt, at that time, I felt like it was a spiritual confirmation, but I felt like that I had received some kind of an endowment of priesthood in the temple. That was my experience. And then later I did the research that said, oh yeah, it's there. You saw it. You felt it. But I think things have changed so much now. I mean, it'd be interesting to ask somebody who's been more recently what their take is. But, even like the initiatory ordinances, when I first went to the temple, a lot of women I talked to, the part they liked the best was the initiation, where, you're used to go where you were naked and then you had this big robe around you and they anointed you. And, people didn't touch, at least I never heard anybody say that you were touched inappropriately. But, the language for me really felt like it was priesthood again. And then the ceremony, but that was my experience. And I kind of felt like maybe I was an outlier.
But if it wasn't priesthood that the women were doing it with, what power was
my question? That was my question. And so I don't know how people experience it now, if they feel that at all. So I don't know, Rebecca, if you felt anything,
Just terrified, PTSD. I went 5 times total, had just bizarre, horrific experiences every time, and then never went back. So no, I was just really, really scared the whole time.
I always
really
felt
scared.
a little guilty that I had good experiences. But I think one of the reasons I had good experiences, I was not getting married. And I was an English major, and I was taking classes in ancient Greek and Latin. And I was reading all about the ancient mystery religions. And I saw a lot of parallels between the ancient mystery religions that I knew from my classical scholarship and the temple. So I had a whole different context. It was, and in fact, I think one of the reasons I had a positive experience is that because I wasn't getting married, I didn't connect anything I did there as me being subordinate or obeying a man. So I think I had a very, different experience than most people did. Although I have talked to women that have had positive experiences where they did feel they were given priesthood. But I think the majority are more like you, Rebecca.
Yeah.
In the book, you were kind of talking about the difference between, I think it was ecclesiastical priesthood versus administrative priesthood.
Yeah, Melchizedek, and maybe I should make that distinction. So again, I use the term ecclesiastical, which is kind of a technical term. Basically, that just means the priesthood that is administered in the church. So, men going up through the Aaronic priesthood, you're the deacon, the priest, and then, the elder and blah, blah, blah. You go from Aaronic to Melchizedek, and then you have offices and callings. That's the ecclesiastical priesthood, the whole structure, the 12 apostles, etc. The fullness of the Melchizedek priesthood, I think, as Joseph Smith saw it, I think it encompassed that. He didn't, again, if you look at all of his statements, he didn't see the fullness of the priesthood as a different thing. It was like that the other priesthood was sort of building up to that, and the temple was, first of all, giving you a fullness of that. He loved that term, fullness. And then the second anointing sealed that on you. And strictly speaking, then you go back to that statement about Elijah, that gave you the right and the keys to sort of function in any way in the priesthood. But I can say that Joseph Smith did this on more than one occasion, where he would set up more than one system where they conflict with each other. And I think it did. And, so their method of dealing with it was, well, we're just forget that fullness thing, right? And it's got to be through the church.
Another reason that very well could have been happening too is because, like I reviewed and interviewed with Joe Steve Swick and those guys. This one right here. Hold on. The book, Method Infinite.
Oh,
By Cheryl Bruno, Joe Swick, and Nick Latursky. They bring in the Masonic connection. So you're probably right. There is various different types and kinds of emphasis that did not fully jive at all.
Well, but I think one of the interesting things, suddenly what is his name, who wrote all about the Masons and the temple and all, I know him very well, and suddenly I can't remember his name, but I'll think of it in a second. But well, there were two who actually wrote about it. You know who I'm talking about, Carrie. He's in one of my footnotes, right? But
I'll look it up while you're talking.
Look it up. But there, obviously, Joseph Smith was influenced by the Masonic rituals. But to me, one of the interesting differences, and this to me is actually wonderful and startling, is that you do not have the fact that he included women in the temple ceremony, and they were anointed to the fullness, and they were part of the quorum of the anointing. That's not at all Masonic.
No,
women were, so I find that quite startling. And, I'll give Joseph Smith credit for that, but I think that's a good thing he did, because that's not Masonic at all.
Oh, not at all. And he did get in trouble for that. They were mad.
That was seen as a betrayal of his Masonic connections and oaths and so forth. So I think that's quite startling that he did that. I'll think of the name of the person too. You find it, Carrie. But
we're both going to blush for embarrassment. We apologize for the author.
No, I just say, well, names kind of escape me and then come back in. But
believe it or not, we are all actually over 29 here.
Yeah,
barely. We're barely over 29.
I know that sometimes names escape me, but I can conjugate the full Greek verb without any help. So I still have.
There you go. There you go.
You do that, and by that time, I'll have him.
Yeah. So I don't know. Any other things that Landon or Rebecca wanted to bring up?
Well, I was thinking about what you said about your friend, why stay? And, I was kind of in that boat too, where I knew that existed as an undercurrent and you just kind of accepted it. But there is one story that I always tell, although I feel it's perfectly suited for this program, where my youngest son was going to be ordained a deacon. And so that happens in the classroom, during priesthood meetings. So the rest of the family, we were called out of our auxiliary classes to go and see my youngest son being ordained. So it's my husband, my 2 other sons, because I have only boys, and then me. And so we all walk down the hall and we head toward this deacon's room. And my little son's already in there with this quorum and 2 leaders. And my next son goes in, my next son goes in, my husband goes in. I start to go into the room and I'm blocked. And they say, we are going to do priesthood business and then you can come in. And they shut the door. And in the room are 11-year-old boys, my teenage sons. I think I was older than anybody in that room. I think I had a higher degree than anybody in the room, and yet I just stood outside that door. The door was shut on me until the priesthood business was finished, and then I could go in. And that was a moment very pivotal to me where I really saw what it meant. I really saw my role. I really did have a door literally shut in my face, and understood that the door had figuratively been shut in my face this entire time. So
Right.
I think a lot of women, maybe things like that happen where they finally do realize, and then they have to kind of make a decision once that happens.
Right. And I think I say somewhere in my essay that a 12-year-old boy has more priesthood authority than his mother. And even
that's what happened to me.
Yeah. And even though the church now likes to say, like, Oakes has made a big deal out of this. Well, he has said women and men are equal in the priesthood in the home, but not in the church. He makes that big distinction between church priesthood and kind of the ceiling. I think it's still patriarchal, quite frankly. But in your home, the whole question would be, if the husband's not there. In fact, I used to hear debates about this. If the husband's not there, does the mother preside, or is it the priesthood holding son? And, and one experience I had, Rebecca, that really brought that home. And I'm trying to remember when they have the solemn assembly, when a new president is kind of sustained, I don't know if they even still do this anymore, because they've somehow, eliminated a lot of rituals, but they had the vote by priesthood quorum. And they would, go from the top to the bottom, including the deacons. And then after the deacons voted, then the women. And that, I remember sitting through this, solemn assembly and thinking, oh my, look. I am, all the men, including the deacons, my position in the church is less than all of that. I have less of a vote, less of a say than all of those, even the young men. And it's funny because I wrote an essay once where I said that when Gloria Steinem came to Salt Lake in the 90s, she made the statement, the Mormon church has created more feminists than I ever have, with the idea that often it's because of the abuse of the system. And I have to say that going to BYU made me a feminist, because I could not believe, and it was worse then than it is now, believe me, that I couldn't believe how much reverence was given to men and how they were seen as the ones that should have leadership, including that they should be paid more, right, than women. Yeah. And, they've gotten a little better, but it was there very strongly.
Reed Durham?
What?
Reed Durham?
That wasn't the one I was thinking of. I'm gonna drive me crazy until I think of his name, but I don't want to look it up.
No, that's all right.
If I just even called into my husband in the other room, he would say it. It's also not Philip. It is, what's his name? I know him. He's a friend. But anyway,
I'm sure we'll hear about it in the comments.
Joseph Smith and the Endowment. There's a whole book, Joseph Smith and the Endowment. And he does a lot on the Masons too. So there's a lot of good scholarship out there, actually. So, yeah.
Well, Margaret, when you said that you got a standing ovation at the Harvard School of Divinity, I think you get a standing ovation tonight too, because
too. This has been amazing.
I've learned so much more about women in the priesthood than I ever knew. You've been so enlightening.
Well, good. I'm glad.
I'm
the teacher, right? I like to enlighten. I like to bring in good information and so forth. And I have to say, it's been such a delight to meet the three of you. I'd love to come back and talk about Heavenly Mother another time. That would be fun. By the way, I think the essay in the book on the Heavenly Mother is really excellent, written by Caroline Klein and Rachel Hunt Steenblick, or I always get her names mixed. I know both of them very well, and they're very good scholars. I thought they did an excellent job on there.
They did. We had a lot of fun talking about that. Yeah, Caroline Klein and Rachel Hunt Steenblick.
They're very good scholars.
I can always do more. I had very good response publicly and in private emails that they said, please do more on Heavenly Mother. You really have a way with that subject. And it wasn't me, it was these two fault.
Well, and one of the things I like to say is that even if you don't believe in God, the power of the symbol of the feminine divine, I think, is extremely important for people. That you have a God figure, you have a powerful figure that represents female divinity. And again, I think that's true whether you believe in God or not. It's just a powerful symbol. And because of the strong patriarchal nature of all of the, whether it's Christianity, Judaism, or Islam,
right?
Although all of them have feminist movements and alternative traditions, right? Yeah. But that image, and all of them have remnants of the feminine divine. And I think it's very important because I think psychologically, again, you don't have to believe in God, but psychologically, that's a very powerful idea.
And there's a lot of people right now in chat saying, yes, please. Margaret Toscano, please do come back. And yes, on the Heavenly Mother. So
this has been so much fun. So I would love to.
What hit me on those essays wasn't so much the feminine divine, but the feminine humanity, because it just shows the women and how intelligent women we have or had in the church before they kick them out. It's just incredible to read your work.
Or drive them out.
Yeah, just impressive.
And we're grateful that they've done that because now we get to enjoy you and your knowledge and your perspective. Whereas if I was an apologist, I wouldn't have had this opportunity. Yep. I would have been trying to refute you, which is silly. That doesn't understand anything. So
well, and I think one of the sad things that goes back to even the ordination of women, as well as just strong, intelligent women in the church, is that the church suffers because of this issue. Yeah. When you exclude half of, it's not just they're excluded from the kind of the top positions, but one of the things I point out in my essay is that because of the structure of the church, the prophetic voice is seen as coming only through men. And so the voices of men, it's not just that you have more authority, but that your voices are valued more. You're seen as more speaking for God. And that is such a disservice, not just to the women that are excluded, but to the whole church and the blessing that these women could be to the church if they would just open up. And obviously we saw that with race issues too. The not just that we're excluding people, but we're cutting off an important interactions in community and
that we have in every other part of our lives.
Right.
So well, we are at 2 hours, and
I know. Look at us.
Isn't it awesome?
Went like that. It was so good. Oh my goodness.
We're not going to do that. We are going to promise to all four of us get back together and share some more issues with you guys. And Margaret, once again, we thank you for coming. Mormonish, you too. You're always welcome on my show.
Yeah, well, thank you. This has been a delight. Such an honor to be with you. Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate this. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Our good pleasure. And for the rest of my audience, remember one thing. Be good, do well, have fun, play hard, work hard, get lots of sleep, and do come back soon because that's what we're going to do.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Mormonish. We really appreciate our listeners and would love to hear from you if you have a story you'd like to share. You can email us at mormonishpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on our website, mormonishpodcast.org. And don't forget to look for us on YouTube and like and subscribe. Keep joyful, everybody.